Waldo Lecker. In the 1944 noir masterpiece Laura, Clifton Webb's Waldo Lecker wasn't just a villain. He was an emblem of a certain cinematic queerness that dared not speak its name. Introduced narrating from his bathtub, surrounded by antiques and classical music, Lecker was elegance personified, urbane, acerbic, and thoroughly contemptuous of anything or anyone that disrupted his carefully ordered world. His obsession with the titular Laura Hunt was immediately unsettling, less romantic than possessive, as though he viewed her not as a person, but as a prized object in his curated life. He didn't merely admire Laura, he aimed to own her. And when the rugged, masculine detective Mark McPherson, played by Dana Andrews, entered the scene, Leidecker's disdain was immediate and seething, with more than a hint of personal tension. Critics and historians have long read these dynamics as coded with queer subtext, especially given the era's strict censorship. The production code, which governed Hollywood's morality until the late 1960s, forbade direct depictions of homosexuality. Still, filmmakers became fluent in suggestion. Lecker became a shining example of this coded storytelling. He fits the sissy archetype described by film historian Vito Russo in The Celluloid Closet. Intelligent, articulate, emotionally volatile, and socially isolated. He's the man who uses intellect and sharpness to wound, rather than fists. His villainy doesn't come from brute force, but from a deeply controlling nature and the fury of being displaced. When Laura dares to fall for someone other than him, it isn't just jealousy, it's the unraveling of an identity built around quiet obsession. The fact that Webb's performance manages to evoke both menace and heartbreak only deepens the queer-coded layers beneath his polished exterior. Clifton Webb himself added to the mystique. He never married, and his personal life remained largely private, which only fueled speculation. He was known for his fastidious elegance, theatrical style, and for living with his mother well into adulthood, which was a detail frequently cited by Hollywood gossips of the time. While it's problematic to reduce an actor's real life to speculation, many researchers believe Webb's innate precision and aloof demeanor informed his portrayal of Lecker. It wasn't just performance, it was embodiment. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination, and more importantly, carved out a space for the sophisticated, emotionally intense antagonist who didn't fit the typical mold of noir masculinity. In a genre built on smoky masculinity and femme fatales, Lecker stood apart. Too well-dressed, too sharp, and far too invested in control. In the realm of Golden Age queer-coded villains, Waldo Lecker remains a quintessential figure. Not because he twirled a mustache or announced his desires, but because he couldn't. That repression became his danger. He was the man scorned, not by a lover, but by a world that refused to acknowledge who he really was. His menace stemmed from elegance turned bitter, obsession cloaked in sophistication, and queerness redirected into control. Lecker wasn't just a villain, he was a coded scream beneath Hollywood's polished whisper, a figure whose silk and acid presence helped lay the groundwork for generations of stylish, dangerous, and deeply queer antagonists to come. Addison Dit. Addison Dit, the venomous theater critic from 1950's All About Eve, didn't just pen spiteful reviews, he established a cinematic model. Played by George Sanders with a voice like a silk razor, DeWitt was urbane, ruthless, and emotionally impenetrable. His indifference toward women, paired with his cultivated style and acerbic wit, has long fueled readings of the character as coded LGBTQ, a discreet yet potent signal in an era when the production code barred open queer themes. Some historians argue DeWitt followed the lead of earlier coded antagonists like Joel Cairo and Waldo Lecker. Yet his depiction remains among the most suave and unmistakable. His manipulation of Eve Harrington wasn't driven by passion, it was a demonstration of power, a spectacle of control cloaked in charm. Gossip contends that DeWitt was inspired by real Broadway critics known for their biting wit and rumored homosexuality, though no specific names were confirmed. In The Celluloid Closet, Vito Russo points to characters like DeWitt as emblematic of Hollywood's tendency to portray queerness through intelligence, detachment, and a lust for domination. For some viewers, he's a study in psychological subtlety. For others, a reminder of how queerness was once equated with menace. Either way, Addison DeWitt didn't merely critique the spotlight, he seized it. Mrs. Danvers. In Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca from 1940, The ominous presence of Mrs. Danvers introduced one of classic Hollywood's earliest and most unsettling queer-coded villains. Played with unnerving stillness by Judith Anderson, Danvers drifts through Manderley like a shadow tethered to the memory of the late Rebecca. Her reverent handling of Rebecca's belongings, the slow, lingering caress of a negligee, and the hushed awe in her voice suggest a devotion far beyond professional duty. Her icy disdain for the new Mrs. De Winter doesn't read as mere disapproval. It simmers with something more intimate, more possessive. Under the constraints of the Hays Code, which strictly banned explicit depictions of homosexuality, Danvers' obsession had to be threaded in glances and gestures, and yet it screamed. Hitchcock, a master of psychological subtext, urged Anderson to play Danvers as almost spectral, gliding silently, her voice cool, her emotions tightly contained. It's this very restraint that makes her so unnerving. When Danvers attempts to coax the second Mrs. De Winter towards suicide, it's not just villainy, it's emotional domination, a jealous erasure of the woman she sees as defiling Rebecca's legacy. There's a twisted intimacy in her manipulation, as if she's reclaiming a lost love by proxy. Though Anderson never publicly acknowledged the character's implied sexuality, her performance carved out a space for queer villainy on screen, tragic, chilling, and impossible to ignore. Rebecca went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and has since been preserved in the Library of Congress for its cultural significance, much of which owes itself to Anderson's performance. Danvers became a blueprint for generations of lesbian-coded villains. Women marked by cold authority, emotional repression, and a possessive streak that often turned lethal. From Nurse Ratched's clinical control to Disney's Ursula, which was inspired by the drag queen Divine, echoes of Mrs. Danvers haunt the villain's wing of cinematic history. She became the blueprint for the ruthless matron trope, where queerness and menace were folded into one tightly laced corset. In the glittering, repressed world of Golden Age Hollywood, queerness couldn't speak its name, but it found ways to haunt the margins. Mrs. Danvers didn't twirl a mustache or flash a wicked grin. She weaponized silence, grief, and longing. Her queerness wasn't her villainy, it was the wound driving it. And in encoding that queerness into such an indelible figure, Hitchcock and Anderson gave the screen one of its most complex and enduring antagonists. Mrs. Danvers didn't just guard Rebecca's memory, she became it, binding her own identity to a love that dare not be named, but could still burn the house down. Bruno Anthony. Bruno Anthony, the smooth-talking killer in Alfred Hitchcock's 1951 thriller Strangers on a Train, remains one of the most notorious studies in covertly gay villainy from Hollywood's golden age. Played with unnerving charisma by Robert Walker, Bruno is flamboyant, fixated, and strongly implied to be gay, though never overt due to the production code's tight oversight. His fascination with tennis star Guy Haines surpassed mere criminal alliance. From fondling Guy's lighter to breathing promises of their arrangement with unsettling closeness, Bruno's every move dripped with homoerotic subtext that critics continue to analyze. Patricia Highsmith's original novel dealt with that tension more explicitly, but Hitchcock, bound by the moral gatekeepers of the period, relied on nuance and performance. It's said he even nudged Walker to subtly emphasize Bruno's queerness to amplify the creeping sense of dread. In post-war America, queerness was commonly branded as deviant, and Bruno's delicate demeanor, flamboyant clothes, and disinterest in women made him a cinematic misfit. He wasn't Hollywood's first such character. Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca had already paved the way, but Bruno solidified the archetype of the intriguing, coded gay antagonist. Walker's performance drew acclaim, with the New York Times praising his brilliant study in menace. Heartbreakingly, it would be among his last roles. On August 28, 1951, Walker died from an adverse reaction to a sedative prescribed by his psychiatrist. His untimely end cast an eerie shadow over his legacy. Bruno Anthony remains a figure who sparks debate. Was he a casualty of repressive conventions or a quiet rebellion hiding in plain sight? Dorian Gray. In 1945, MGM adapted Oscar Wilde's notorious novel for the screen with The Picture of Dorian Gray, a production that stands as a textbook illustration of veiled LGBTQ menace during the Code era. Herb Hatfield's Dorian wasn't just handsome. He was chillingly flawless, emotionally remote, and adrift in immorality. While critics at the time admired his cool mystique, later commentators point to that same aloofness as an example of coded threat. a trope repeatedly relied upon to convey otherness covertly. The camera's recurring fixation on Dorian's face and figure, particularly in scenes of vanity, underscored his allure in ways rarely granted to male characters then. George Sanders, portraying the beguiling Lord Henry, delivered lines steeped in decadent philosophy, engaging a rapport with Dorian that danced around forbidden intimacy without ever crossing a line. Because of the production code's strict bounds, outright homosexual themes were off limits, but subtleties thrived, and here the charge between Dorian and Lord Henry felt intentional. Some film historians maintain that Dorian's moral ruin was framed as a warning, with his hedonism and aestheticism posing as veiled metaphors for suppressed longing. Rumors in Hollywood persisted that Hatfield's private life mirrored the character's hidden identity. Whether factual or not, the speculation only enhances the film's legacy. Although audiences in the 1940s might have overlooked the deeper suggestions, 20th century queer critics reclaimed Dorian as a poignant illustration of repression, his portrait deteriorating in secrecy while he remained untarnished in every sense. Nowadays, the film is broadly hailed as a watershed in queer horror, not despite its coded nature, but precisely because of it. Dr. Ptorius. In 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, Dr. Ptorius wasn't just a mad scientist, he was a walking provocation. Played by Ernest Thesiger with theatrical flair and a voice dipped in irony, Ptorius became one of early Hollywood's most overtly queer-coded villains. His arched brows, languid gestures, and fondness for fine wine weren't just eccentricities. They were calculated signals, smuggled past the Hays Code by a production that knew exactly what it was doing. Thesiger, a known eccentric who moved in artistic circles that included openly gay author W. Somerset Maugham, brought a camp sensibility that was hard to miss. James Whale, who was gay and whose sexuality was known within certain Hollywood circles, directed the film with a knowing touch. Many scholars believe Whale encouraged Thesiger to emphasize the character's flamboyance and theatricality, crafting a figure who was both unsettling and magnetic. Pretorius's dismissive attitude toward women, his obsessive rapport with Frankenstein, and his intimate manipulation of their shared creation project formed a dynamic that many critics and historians interpret as suggestive of a veiled romantic or homoerotic subtext. Some dare to guess that Whale was using Ptorius to mock the paranoia around queer influence, hiding satire in the shadows of horror. Ptorius didn't just steal scenes, he forged a lasting impact. He remains an early and influential example of queer-coded villainy in Hollywood horror, a character whose danger was inseparable from his charisma. Sir Humphrey Pengalan. In Alfred Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn, released in 1939, Charles Laughton's version of Sir Humphrey Pengalan did more than merely scheme. He delivered a flourish of camp theatricality. As a crooked magistrate with a penchant for grand showmanship, Pengalan brought together a curious blend of farce and threat. Film scholars have since noted his dramatic gestures, ornate attire, and conspicuous absence of romantic pursuits as telltale markers of the queer-coded villain, then prevalent under moral censorship. While there is no clear record of an intentional LGBTQ+ angle in the script, contemporary scholars frequently identify the role as an early model of how queerness was hinted at through depravity. Laughton himself, whose personal life has long been murky, injected a singularly stylized spirit into the part, a style some read as rebellion against Hollywood's enforced norms. Anecdotes indicate that Laughton's creative authority on the production, he co-produced and wielded considerable influence, may have lent the character its fluid tone, even though Hitchcock allegedly bristled at the actor's overpowering involvement. Although Jamaica Inn isn't typically grouped with Hitchcock's more overtly coded films like Rope or Psycho, Pengalan remains an intriguing relic, an antagonist whose eccentric showmanship and detachment implied the unspeakable. Joel Cairo. Joel Cairo entered the scene in 1941's The Maltese Falcon, and with him emerged one of classic Hollywood's earliest and most enduring coded villains. Portrayed by Peter Lorre, Cairo was never openly labeled as gay, but his soft tone, perfumed handkerchief, and finicky demeanor were hardly overlooked by viewers. Operating under the limitations of Hollywood's moral guidelines, which prohibited direct portrayals of homosexuality, filmmakers leaned heavily on suggestion. Lorre's performance was calculated, theatrical, and unmistakably suggestive. In Dashiell Hammett's original 1930 novel, Cairo's homosexuality was stated plainly. But by the time director John Huston adapted the story, that detail had to be buried beneath implication. Film historian Vito Russo later identified Cairo in The Celluloid Closet as a prime illustration of the sissy villain, a trope equating queerness with moral deviance. Russo contended that Cairo's difference made him threatening, not in spite of it. Some film scholars note that Laurie's outsider status, he was a Jewish émigré who fled Nazi Germany, may have given him particular sensitivity to marginalized characters. Stories circulate that Laurie, exasperated by typecasting, chose to play up Cairo's idiosyncrasies as a subtle resistance against Hollywood's stifling norms. Whether that's fact or folklore, Joel Cairo defined a template, the refined, ambiguous antagonist whose queerness was concealed in plain sight. Brandon and Philip. Brandon and Philip, the killers at the heart of Alfred Hitchcock's 1948 film Rope, weren't just cold-blooded murderers. They were coded as something else altogether. Their on-screen dynamic, full of veiled glances and tightly coiled tension, hinted at a romantic connection that couldn't be named under the era's rigid production code. The film, inspired by the notorious 1924 Leopold and Loeb case, followed two intellectual elitists who strangle a classmate for sport, then host a dinner party over the hidden corpse. In real life, Leopold and Loeb were widely believed to be romantically involved, a detail Hitchcock echoed through implication rather than direct statement. Farley Granger, who played the more anxious Philip, later identified as bisexual in his 2007 memoir. His co-star, John Dahl, was long rumored to be gay, though he never spoke of it openly. Certain observers believe Hitchcock may have leaned into their off-screen personas to heighten the film's psychological charge, though no records confirm this. Screenwriter Arthur Lawrence, who is openly gay, once hinted that the subtext was intentional. Critics at the time sidestepped the tension, calling the lead's relationship peculiar or morbid. Today it's recognized as a classic LGBTQ subtext. The character's arrogance, refined taste, and Nietzschean superiority weren't simply villainous. They were drenched in mid-century stereotypes of deviant sexuality. Film historians have described Rope as a cinematic exercise in repression, both in its form and its content. The Hays office reportedly drew scrutiny during production, but no edits were mandated. Still, audiences in 1948 didn't quite know what to make of it. Some found it too cerebral, others too morally ambiguous. Over time, Rope has been re-examined as more than just a technical showcase. In the shadows of its long takes and locked apartment, it quietly introduced covertly queer killers into mainstream cinema, long before Hollywood was prepared to say it out loud. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.